And we thank you all for coming. We've got a great speaker lined up. Jackie will introduce our speaker. We do need to go real quick to just, Dutch can give us a treasurer's report and then we'll move on. Dutch?
I've been in the hospital twice this month and just got out of the hospital 2 days ago. So I don't have the treasurer's report, but I will finish it and send it to everybody next week.
Okay, you can just put it on our members only section if you'd like. That would be easier for you.
Okay.
Let Lynn is the one.
All right, Lynn, would you like to introduce our speaker since you is acquainted with them?
Sure. Now, I went years ago whenever I was researching novels or writers who wrote vampire stories, because I was working on a vampire story. I came across Darren's Peter and the Vampires. And I was like, what is that? And then I like, oh, it's a young adult one. I like reading kid books. Let's see how it is. And so I was in Chicago at the time, and I started reading his first book on my phone on Kindle. And I literally, while riding the subway around town, that's all I did was read his books. I missed 2 of my exits because I got involved in the book so good. And I was like, man, how is he doing this? Because Peter and the Vampires, or the Peter stories, to me, it's kind of a mixture of Lemony Snicket meets, I couldn't say Harry Potter, but the Hardy Boys with some paranormal all mixed in. And he's got these wide range of characters that is someone that kids can relate to and adults can relate to if they're having to read the books with their kids. So I was really, really impressed with him and have been reading him for a while. And so whenever Zoom opportunity came available, I went ahead and said, we've got to get him to speak. And he graciously said yes. So his bio that he sent says, Darren wanted to be a writer ever since he was about 8 years old. When he had to sneak away from his super religious mom at a grocery store to read Stephen King books in the paperback aisle. He started writing at 18, he's now 48, and wrote but never published 3 novels before going off to Hollywood to become a screenwriter. And that didn't exactly work out. He self-published his first book, Imaginary Friends, back in 2007, before Kindle existed, and that didn't work out either. I'm starting to see a trend.
Yes.
Then he started writing a children's series in 2008 about a 10-year-old boy who moves into his grandfather's creepy old mansion, and bad things start to happen. In 2011, he self-published Peter and the Vampires, the first of what would turn out to be a 14-volume comprised 45 stories. He just recently self-published the final volume, Peter and the Devil, in December 2021. And over the years, he's written under a handful of pen names in different genres, including romance, fantasy. He's self-published over 40 novels, and he's made his living writing fiction for the last 10 years. And he currently teaches an online course on how to finish a rough draft of your novel in 30 days. So along with teaching or giving us details on how to write for young people and capture their voice and interest, he's also going to give us tips on how to get a novel draft done in 30 days if you're interested. Dan, I'm gonna turn it over to you. I do want to say that if anyone has questions, because we're operating in different locations, what I would prefer is if you put your questions in the chat, and then I will call you out at the end, so that way you can ask the question to Darren. I just need to make for sure who has what questions, so that way I can call on you. It makes things a lot easier. Okay, Darren, I'm shutting up and it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Good to see you all. Good to hear those introductions. Thank you. I got to say that when Lynn invited me here, I was actually kind of intimidated, because I'm like, what am I going to tell these people about writing mysteries? That's one of, I've written fantasy, romance, action adventure, thrillers, but not really so much mystery. And then I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, okay, yeah, there especially the Peter stories tend to have a mystery component to them. So at least I'll try to be entertaining. We'll put it that way. And yeah, please put your questions into the chat, because if you don't, I think this is going to run shorter than Lynn probably intended it to. Although that was the I didn't know about the telling the thing about finishing a rough draft in 30 days, so that might extend it some. But if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, because otherwise there will be a deathly awkward silence at the end, and I don't think any of us wants that, least of all me. So, and you can kind of see Lynn asked me for, do you want to do a PowerPoint? And I'm bad with tech, so this is my system for my own personal PowerPoint. And he said one of the things that he wanted me to do was talk about writing mystery suspense for a children YA audience and how to capture the voice and the attention. Well, I'll start off with the attention part, which is extremely hard to do. Not so much, let's talk about it from a marketing perspective and as an indie. Knowing too who some of your past speakers have been was a bit intimidating, and I'm sure some of you are like doing great in some of the genres. I'm going to be like, don't do that, don't do that. But the problem with children's, and I want to specify, I'm not talking about like Goodnight Moon children's stories, and I'm not talking about kind of like chapter books for beginning readers. Those may do gangbusters, but sort of where I came in at was Harry Potter-esque in that first book, where it starts off as children, and over the course of 14 box sets, it definitely turns into a very dark young adult series. But the problem is with starting off with a children's series and the way I did it, where really the protagonists are about 10 years old at the beginning, but it's really aimed for a much older sensibility. In fact, most of my fans are like 20 to 65 years old. I have people all the time writing in saying, I can't believe I'm like 65 years old and I love this series. And I'm like, come on in, man, join the club. Everybody here is way over the supposed age that the readers are supposed to be. The problem with writing this sort of series, if you're an indie and if you have to market it yourself, is there are no 10 to 12-year-olds trolling Amazon for the latest indie release. So you're going to have a tough time reaching your target audience. At some point, when I kind of gear myself up for battle, the way I would do it is, number one, here, I'll show you at least. So that's, I'm not sure if the image is backwards. That was the very first book I published. And this is the last one tying it all up that happened, that I published back in December. What I would do, and if you are in kind of my shoes and you have the wherewithal and the knowledge, I would go after the parents. You want to look for the parents if you're going to try to sell this sort of thing as an independent. Obviously, if you've got a publisher, they'll have much better resources and channels to do it. But the way I would do it is I'd be like, hey, mom, does little Johnny not like to read? Get him this book and tell him that he probably shouldn't read it because there are bad things in it. So if you can get them on that, if you can hook them on the forbidden, then that would be the way I would sell mine. If yours doesn't lean towards that direction, then obviously don't use that angle. I was actually advised not to write for the audience I was writing by agents, and I ignored the warning and I paid the price, at least financially. The whole series is a labor of love for me. I do consider it my life's work, and I wouldn't change a thing in how I did it. But yeah, it's not made me much money. Most of my, like 98% of my living financially has come from writing romance and fantasy over the last 10 years. I started in roughly 2007. You heard about, I went to Hollywood and I wrote a script called Imaginary Friends. They took it out to the different studios and I got some meetings out of it. It didn't sell. And I was crushed and I left. I kind of gave up on screenwriting, but I really loved that story. So I novelized it and I published it before Kindle existed. So it came out as a paperback and nothing. But that got me back into it. And I really wanted to do a series of horror novels. Also, another thing genre I don't recommend trying to make a living in. And there's probably somebody here who's killing it in horror. But I wanted to do a bunch of, like you heard, when I was 8 years old, I used to sneak into the paperback aisle to read Stephen King novels. And my mom, she didn't know, and she'd call from the end of the aisle, Darren, she was ready to go, and I'd jump and put the paperback and then run out. But so I wanted to do a series of horror novels, but I didn't want to do standalones. I didn't want to have to keep reintroducing the characters. I didn't want to have to keep coming up with new characters. So I was like, I'll do a series. Yeah, I'll do a series, and I'll do it like the X-Files. It'll be a monster of the week for every different novella that I write. And there'll be an overarching conspiracy. There'll be some sort of mystery at the heart of it. And so that's what I did. I used to pitch it as it's the X-Files meets the Simpsons, because it's very funny. There's a very comedic sensibility to the whole thing. It takes place in a small town with a cast of oddball characters. And so like the Simpsons. And then somebody else nailed it later on. They said, it's basically Scooby-Doo without the dog, right? And I was like, yeah, I guess so. They're a lot younger. They start off a lot younger than the Scooby-Doo crowd, but yeah, that's basically it, Scooby-Doo without the dog. Although it gets a lot darker. Like I said, there's the trappings of horror novels. I use a lot of classic horror movies for some of the stories. Number 20 in the entire series is Peter and the Demon, which I explain to people as, yeah, it's The Exorcist, for kids, which might have some sort of, it might be one reason that I had difficulty marketing the series. But when I decided on the X-Files angle, the first thing he does is his mother and his little sister move into his grandfather's mansion. They do a cross-country trip, and he moves into his grandfather's creepy old mansion, and really bad, sinister things start to happen. And the beginning of the mystery aspect starts that he realizes, he keeps asking his grandfather, why are these things happening? And his grandfather lies, and he's a very bad liar. He's this rough, cranky old curmudgeon, but he's not a good liar. So Peter knows that something's wrong, but we don't really get into the overarching part until books. And when I say books, I mean story 5 and story number 6 in the series. Story 5, Peter and the Mannequins, is he and his best friend Dill, the troublemaking kid next door. And I absolutely stole that from Harper Lee's novel. I was like, I want him to have a best friend like Dill from To Kill a Mockingbird. That's what I want. And I was like, what do I call him? What do I call him? And I was like, I'll call him Dill for now. I'll just leave him as a placeholder. And then don't ever do that. Try to figure out, if you name him after a very famous character, it's going to end up sticking. And I was like, I can't change him to Joe or Bubba or anything like that. He's Dill now. So he's basically like Dill in To Kill a Mockingbird, but not nearly as smart, and a whole lot goofier. And an even bigger troublemaker, if that's possible. So in story number 5, Peter and the Mannequins, they get trapped inside a mall at night. And what they find out is that the mannequins come alive at night. And the reason they do that, and I started really introducing a darker element with that book, a very dark element. You understand in that story that Peter he's the 13th in a long line of people who their stories will figure in later in the series. But there were some really awful people in his family, and one of them was lived in the early American colonies and slaughtered a group of Native American women and children. And that was actually based on the 9th president of the United States. I think it was Benjamin Henry Harrison, who also has the distinction of being the shortest president because he gave such a long-winded speech in the cold and rain at his inauguration that he caught pneumonia and died 6 weeks later, which was a fitting end for a guy who did go in and slaughter a bunch of women and children and campaigned on it. His slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe was the place where the slaughter took place. And so I actually based that character on it. And there's a lot of machinations, I won't go into it, but you find out that he has bad people in his lineage. And there was a curse put on his family by the Native American tribe who his ancestor killed. So that starts off the idea of there's this curse hanging around. Then in book 6, Peter and the psycho trick-or-treaters, which sounds fun on the at the outset, which is really one of, I think, one of the most nerve-wracking stories. He and Dill are out trick-or-treating, and they're beset upon by this small group of look like kindergartners, really small kids in creepy masks. And then it turns into, they get into a tussle, he and Dill escape, and then the kids show up later at his house, and it turns into a home invasion story. And it's very tense, it's very scary, but that was the start of the really big conspiracy. And it was the start of everything had a supernatural overtone to it, but that was the one where like the first hints of what was going to be the major storyline. And initially, I was just going to lay it all out in book 6 and story 6. I was going to tell everybody everything. And I got all the broad strokes ready to go. And I was like, you know, I ought to be more like the X-Files and milk this for as long as possible. So I took all the details out that I was going to spill. I left in a few breadcrumbs. The big clue is that the demonic little trick-or-treaters carve one more year into the door before they leave. And they also tell him, Peter, before they leave, they say, tell your grandfather the boss says one more year. And then they take off. And what I did with that was I then, from that point on, and of course, grandfather lies again. You know something's up, something's bad. He's only got 1 year to figure something out. And then I started dropping breadcrumbs, just little pieces of the puzzle one at a time, every story or every other story. And sometimes, you know, there wasn't really any new addition. And what I did too was I interwove like, which curse is it? Which one? What's the horrible story? Is it the one with the Native Americans, or is it the one with these trick-or-treaters? What you eventually find out all the way in story number 33. I waited until story number 33 to lay it all out finally. So I milked it as much as possible. I mean, the last story is number 45. So 33 out of 45, I took my time. What you find out is that I mentioned before, Peter's the 13th in a long line of this family. And the initial guy, the one at the very beginning, St. John Flanagan, was basically a serial killer and a sociopath in Ireland around the time of Oliver Cromwell. And he's about to be executed when Cromwell's army comes into a small town and they slaughter everybody. And they figure since he was on the docket to be killed, he must be okay. And he lies to them and says, yeah, no, I'm a Protestant. I'm like you guys. I'm not a Catholic, but I know I'm Irish and I know all the towns around here. I know all the monasteries and everything. I can take you there. And so he's incorporated into Cromwell's army, and he moves up through the ranks, and he's able to kill as much as he wants. So he's a truly awful person. But what he does, I mean, horrific. What he does is he finds out that there's this mirror in one of the monasteries. It's a story. And supposedly St. Patrick trapped something inside the mirror. And St. John becomes obsessed with finding it. And so when he finally does, he leads a contingent of soldiers into a monastery, slaughters everyone, finds the mirror. It's what leads to Peter and the devil. And it's basically, it's not the devil, but it's an ancient Sumerian fire god. And St. John strikes a Faustian bargain with him that he will get eternal youth and riches beyond compare if St. John and the creature that's trapped, the spirits that trapped in the mirror, says, okay, I'll give you that in exchange for my freedom, but I also, that's a big deal you're asking for. So I want your soul, and I want the next 12 generations of souls in your lineage. And St. John figures he can outsmart the devil, so he agrees to that. And that leads to all the horrific things that happen around the family, this curse that has lingered over them for hundreds of years, and that Peter, he's the last hope, basically. He's the one who has to train and to take on this ultimate antagonist at the very end in order to save his soul, his mother and his sister's souls, and his grandfather's soul. And that's the overarching, that's the mystery element of it. A lot of the other stories that I wrote do have mystery aspects to them. One of the things I did when I was like, I'm going to do the X-Files, but so what I'll do is I'll take a traditional creature or traditional monster, and it'll be the headliner, the marquee name for each individual box set. So Peter and the Vampires, Peter and the Werewolves, Peter and the Frankenstein. There's a big running joke about it's supposed to be the Frankenstein's monster, and Dill is like, no, it's Frankenstein. That's what everybody knows. So mummies, witches, ghosts, so on and so forth, culminating in Peter and the Devil. But then there are a bunch of other minor creatures that are the creature of the week, or things that I had to invent. So the first book, for instance, is Peter and the Dead Men, Peter and the Vampires, Peter and the Changeling, and Peter and the Swamp Monster. And I just kind of continued that pattern. So some of the stories, like Peter and the Frankenstein, involves, this mad scientist who's in town that his grandfather basically rescued from obscurity after a scandal, and now he teaches science at the local high school. And then horrible things start happening, as is usual in these stories, and Peter and Dill have to investigate, and they put themselves into danger, and they find out that the good doctor has been stealing corpses and using their body parts to reanimate them as monsters. Peter and the Witches was later on in the series, and it's probably the most mystery, down the line, actual mystery of all the stories, where there's kind of red herrings. There are people who you think are the good guys, they turn out to be the bad guys. Things flip around later on in the stories. There's it's very much the investigative kind of thing. And then there's some others that probably a third of the stories have some element where the characters have to figure out what's going on, and they have to poke around until they figure it out. And then the final act is really the mystery comes unfolded, and he realizes what he actually has to face, and it gets worse from there. So one of the things that Lynn wanted me to talk to you about was trying to capture the voice of my characters. And that's interesting. Partially because, so it depends. And I've lived with my main characters for so long that they seem like real people to me. But, and I have to say this too, I have to tell you the truth, which is really the characters in this novel, they start off as 10-year-olds, and they're just way too precocious. They're a little too wise for their years. They speak a little bit too much like adults. Oh well, Harry Potter does the same thing. I don't exactly buy that Harry and all of his friends are actually appropriate for that age. So whatever, it's all good. They actually do. There's not the same level of real immaturity. It's not a documentary, let's put it that way. What I do a lot in how I kind of create my stories is I daydream. I think that the reason I became a writer is that from a very early age, I had a lot of anxiety. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you give me a thumbs up if, yeah, okay. All right, cool. I had a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear as a small child, and the way that I dealt with it was I would just daydream and slip into a fantasy world. And I read a lot too, but a lot of it was just my imagination, and that helped me cope with social anxiety and all the fears that I dealt with. And what started off as a psychological defense in a lot of ways became what I did for a living. And so even to this day, I daydream, I pace back and forth, and I think, and I run things like a movie in my head. In fact, the last 6 books that made up the end of the series, Peter and the Monsters, I had been thinking about them for the last 6 years. and I'd run individual. I didn't know everything that was going to happen, but the major scenes, I'd run most of them dozens of times in my head, just as purely as entertainment. It was like running a television show or a movie in my head and going back and watching my favorite parts. That's what I did for fun, to relax. And there was a lot of daydreaming, and that's where the voices come in a way that with the recurring characters, I got to know them pretty well. Probably the one that was easiest was Dill, because I had sort of a model for him in To Kill a Mockingbird. And his voice for me is very distinctive. It's kind of high, it's kind of nasal, and he tends to run on and do a lot of things, and he's a fast talker, and he's a little scoundrel, and he's a bad kid with a heart of gold. And he's the easiest one by far to kind of get the feelings. And Peter was always me. I would tell people Peter was how I actually acted, trying to do the right thing, trying to behave, trying to be sort of a goody-goody. Dill is the kid I wish I'd been, the troublemaker, the one who's like, let's skip school. Yeah, let's do it. If you're going to figure out the voice, and I'm sure, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here. Most people have ample, experience with this. But what I do is, especially in this course that we mentioned, I'll go into that a little at the end. I tell the people in my course that really, when you're getting to know a character, it's like somebody points to you across the room and they're like, see that guy sitting over there on that table? His name's Bob. And he hands you a sheet of paper and you look at what it says about Bob. And it's like, Bob is this age. He's single. He likes dogs. He's smooth with the ladies. He's a happy-go-lucky kind of guy. He's not as smart as he'd like to think. And it gives you all this stuff about Bob. And then you go over with your sheet of paper to Bob and you're like, hey. And he's like, hey, I'm Bob. And I'm like, do you know Bob? No, you don't. You think you know Bob, but until really you follow Bob around for a day or two and see how he interacts with people and what he says and hear his voice, you don't know him. In a lot of cases, that's what I do with a character. I start off thinking I know them. I usually base what I think I know about them on what role they need to be in the story. Especially if it's a supporting character, somebody who just pops up for that story, I'm like, who is this person? And I'll take a stock character, somebody, the grumpy old man, the clueless guy, salesman in the store, the whatever, the snarky teenager. And then I try to, as I create them, it's a dance. It's I have a little sheet of what I think I know about them, but I actually have to create them as I go. One of the things that I talk about in the course is pantsers versus plotters, people who write by the seat of their pants versus people who plot everything out. And in my opinion, it's a false choice. It's a false dichotomy. I've always been a plotter to a certain degree, but I always write the first draft in my head, or at least the big strokes. I tell the people in this course what I do before I write something. When I'm coming up with a story, I come up with what I call badass moments. And that might not be the best name for it because it kind of conjures the image of 12-year-old boys enthusing about giant robots shooting lasers out of their eyes. But what I tell people is that it's scenes that provoke a huge emotional reaction in you, the writer, and that carries out. If you're feeling something, your audience is going to feel it. They should, hopefully. The vast majority, the people you want to reach should feel that. And a lot of the times, since I have a background in writing movies or trying to write movies for Hollywood, I look at movies as the examples in that course. And for instance, one of the biggest ones for me, I'm a huge Star Wars nerd. So one of the biggest ones for me is where Vader's like, Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. That whole scene is a badass scene. It's fantastic. It provokes this enormous emotional response, and how it ends with Luke, in my opinion, Luke choosing it, making an existential choice. He would rather die than join the dark side, and that he willfully makes the effort he's willing to commit suicide, and then it turns out all right. But that's a badass scene. Another one though I give in the course is in the movie Crazy Rich Asians. I have not read the book, so I don't know if follows the book exactly, but there are two that are amazing. One in which the heroine plays a game of, I think it's mahjong, against her could have been, should have been mother-in-law, who was very disapproving and did not want her son to marry the heroine. And she plays this game against the mother-in-law. You think the mother-in-law has won, and the woman at the end, she says, I want you to know, I'm the one that's walking away, because I know that if he chooses to be with me, it's going to destroy your relationship. And I'm choosing it. I'm making it clear that I'm the one that's walking away because I don't want him to hate you. So when you finally do get the daughter-in-law that you truly want, that remember, I'm the one who gave her to you. And then she lays down all her tiles and she's won, and she walks away. And just telling you that, there's this like chill going up the back of my spine. It's fantastic. It's this just two great actors in a super dramatic, high stakes situation with a lot of emotion. The love of her life is on the line, but it feeds into an even better big badass scene later on. And anyone who doesn't want me to spoil the movie, go away for about 3 minutes or cover your ears or mute me. And then I'll wave my hands when you can unmute. But she gets on the plane and her former fiance comes on the plane after her, chases after her, and he proposes. And that's not really the badass scene. That's not the amazing part. She listens to his proposal and he pulls out the ring. And earlier in the movie, there was this big scene where she commented on the potential future-in-law mother's ring and how beautiful it was. And you find out this story, this shameful story, emotionally fraught story about how she, the mother-in-law, was not approved of by her own mother-in-law. It was this giant thing. And when her fiance proposes, the ring he pulls out, that is the mother-in-law's. And at that moment, you realize, oh my God, that's the mother-in-law saying, you win, I approve, you were right. And it's amazing. I mean, I'm getting all verklempt now just thinking about it. And that's the sort of thing I tell my students, and what I've always done is I look for scenes like that. It's usually the 2 or 3 scenes that I'm writing the story or the book for, the ones that I have to write, the ones that are my North Star, that pull me onwards, that, you know, they're the ones that's like, no, you got to write this thing. You got to write this thing. You can't leave that untold. And if I have those 2 or 3 scenes, those form the backbone for me. They're and I arrange everything else around them. How do I get the characters to the first badass scene? Once we're there, how do I get them to the second one? And then from there, how do I get them to the third? And if there are any more, I usually tell people, all you need is really 2 or 3 really great scenes in any story. And that's what people will remember. And if you can stick the landing, that's even better. If you can have a badass scene at the ending, that's great, because that's what you leave your readers with. But the main thing is remembering. Nobody I mean, people do, but they don't remember the ending of The Empire Strikes Back so much as they remember, no, I am your father. They don't remember. That's the thing that really stands out in their minds for them. And as this is something I think that other people have done and they've talked about. Alfred Hitchcock directed a movie called Topaz in 1969. I learned about this in film school. Not one of his more famous ones, probably not one of his better ones either. But the apocryphal story is there's this scene. It takes place, I guess, in Cuba, and there's sort of a Fidel Castro stand-in, and there's a romantic interest, and it's a woman in this beautiful flowing purple dress. And there's a shot where he shoots her. She's betrayed him or something has happened, and he shoots her. And it's shot from overhead, and she's looking up. And the dress that she's wearing, the hem of it is slowly pulled out. The technical way they did it was they had fishing lines, and people were all around her, and they pull out the dress, and it looks like a puddle of blood spreading out from beneath her. And then she collapses onto the floor into it. It's a gorgeous shot. It's amazing. And supposedly it's the reason Hitchcock wanted to do Topaz. That's one scene alone. That was his badass scene, and the way he did the movie. So that's what I tell people is look for something that makes you emotional. That's the reason you have to. And I'm sorry, there's a little bit of noise. Anyway, okay, I think it's gone away. Again, if you're thinking about doing voice, daydream a lot, try to picture, if you can. There's some people that's not how they do it. That's fine. I actually talked to a guy. He said, I found out I have this condition. I don't remember the name of the condition is, but he said, if you say picture an apple in your mind, I can't do it. I cannot picture an apple sitting there. He says, I can think of this general platonic ideal of an apple, but I can't picture a single individual apple. So it's interesting. So there may be people that your mental process is different, but if you can, daydream as much as possible. Run over scenes, those badass scenes that you love that make you feel something, whether it's joy or anger or hatred or shame or some intense emotion. And from there, if you're running your characters through these scenes, you'll gradually get a grasp of their voice. Now, part of the more technical ways I go about doing it is if there's like have them speak. My personal thing is I like people and characters in novels to actually speak the way real people speak. So I want contractions. I want things that aren't grammatical. You don't want every and you don't want every pause. Obviously, that would drive people crazy. But I do tend to try to actually talk out loud as I'm typing. I didn't realize this until I knew I did it a little bit, but I drown myself out with white noise. I try to block out as many distractions as possible so I can write and focus. Some people that wouldn't work for them, but it does for me. But so I didn't realize I was mumbling to myself until I was on vacation with my girlfriend at the time. And she came in the room and I had on my headphones. She like taps me on the shoulder and I look up and she's like, "What are you saying?" And I'm like, What are you talking about? She's like, "You keep mumbling." And I'd been writing this long passage of dialogue and I realized, oh my God, I'm doing it. And other writers do it too. There's a guy named William Goldman, who's a very famous screenwriter. He wrote The Princess Bride. He did the adaptation from Misery. He did Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, is his most famous movie probably that he did. And he said that when he was writing Marathon Man, the book, which later was adapted into a movie with Dustin Hoffman and Sir Laurence Olivier, there's a scene where Olivier's Nazi dentist, years and years after World War II, is torturing Dustin Hoffman. And the famous phrase was, he keeps asking Dustin Hoffman repeatedly, "Is it safe?" And Dustin Hoffman has no idea what he's talking about. He's like, "Yes, it's safe, it's safe." And then Olivier is like, "Is it safe?" And every time he says it a little differently and he keeps doing it, "Is it safe?" And Dustin Hoffman tries every possible, no, it's not safe. No, don't do it. Don't, whatever you do. And then Olivier the dentist, being a dentist, uses an electric drill to torture him by drilling into a tooth. And so he's screaming throughout this. And Goldman wrote the scene. And then he walked out in the hallway the next day, he said, and the woman who lived right next door to him looked at him very strangely. And he was like, "What's that all about?" And then later on, he talked to his wife. She was like, "Yeah, you were screaming the entire time. You were, 'Is it safe? Is it safe?' And you were screaming and living out the scene as he was writing." He had no idea. And I doubt he had earphones on listening to white noise. He was so deeply in the scene and he got the voice down pat of both characters. But yeah, so that's something that I recommend. Actually speak it out loud as you go if you're not doing it already, or try speaking it out loud, see how it sounds. Key repeated words or phrases, catchphrases, basically things that you would see. Since I based Peter and the Monsters on a sort of a television series mentality, there are certain phrases that certain characters say, and Dill's was always, "I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it." He wanted to deny that everything bad that had happened to them had ever happened. He didn't want to face the reality of all these horrible things that were going on. So I don't want to talk about it. When you know what you need the character to be, that helps out a lot in capturing their voice. And about the 9th or 10th story, they get a little girl as a member of the group who turns into a trio. Gwendolyn and she's very dry and sarcastic. That obviously informs her voice. And it took me a while, like going back to the original idea of Bob, you need to follow Bob around. A lot of my characters, when I started out, they don't end up sounding in about a story or two the way they originally started. I'm getting to know them. We're doing the dance. There's a story too, I've never seen it, but if you watch the very first few episodes of Star Trek from the 1960s, Mr. Spock actually smiles in a couple of places. And he's a lot more animated with his voice. He was getting to know the character. The writers were getting to know the character. Once you get them down, once you're familiar with him, you're like, oh, okay. And it's sort of, then it becomes a matter of how do we keep the character interesting. But initially, especially if you're writing a standalone novel, you don't have to worry about that too much. You just have to try to get the character to do what you need them to do. And hopefully they'll surprise you. You always hear about authors who they're like, the character came alive. It did all these things I wasn't expecting. And I've had that experience a couple of times, and it's awesome when it happens. But I'm not really able to duplicate that when it happens, it happens, and it's great. And it's only happened a couple of times for me in my entire career. But if that happens for you, that's awesome. That's the best possible case, where the character just arrives fully formed and kind of like, here I am, now take down dictation. That would be great. But for me, it's very much, let's do the dance. Let's get to know who they are as I create them. It's weird because you're guiding them the way they want to go. But everything they say, every emotion they have, every choice they make becomes something that informs the larger picture of who they are. And I tell people in the course that character is the gradual accretion of choices and details. And that's really what it is. It's everything that person says from the first time they open their mouth, and everything they do becomes who they are. You get to know them, and you have to make all their future choices consistent with what they've done before. Or if they're not consistent, you need to have a pretty good internal reason that you can later justify. You don't want to have them act completely out of the blue, because people will be like, what? Don't have them act just for the expediency of the plot. That's terrible. You want to be able to bake in things, and sometimes that happens in the rewrite. You have to go back and fix the details so that what they do later on is, and I'm sure you guys have to deal with that in mysteries, especially those who, the one thing I tell people is never, ever, ever go back and rewrite. Do the rough draft just all the way through as much as you can. There's a huge temptation, but my first book I wrote for 3 years, and about the second year I went back to rewrite it because so much had changed in plot. I never finished it. It's the only book I've never finished it. And so yeah, never go back and rewrite. Save it for the rewrites and the edits.
Hey, Darren,
yeah,
let me steer you another direction so I can get some
sure.
clarification.
And that was the end of my talk. So
okay, well, you're
30-day rough draft.
You're talking about voice of character and capturing their voice. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think is really useful is because, I have a 20-year-old, but mm-hmm. I don't hang around 10, 11, 12-year-olds. There are some of us who have grandchildren that but we don't hang around with them. So while you're creating a character and a voice for them, how are you assuring that what you're doing is relatable to the age group that you're writing to? What type of research, what type of involvement with a kid, or is it just an osmosis thing? Because for me, I would think that, whenever I write something, I'm not going to hand it off. I'm like, here, Jackie, read this. Is it any good? And, an adult will tell me that. But whenever I'm giving it to a kid, if their response is, yeah, that's okay, how do I know that actually is, beneficial or working?
So that is my greatest. I have a number of flaws, or whatever you want to call them, as a writer. One is I kind of just do what I want to do, and I don't really care about the repercussions. I care about them later when I don't make any money. But with Peter and the Monsters, it was, and another one is I hate doing research. I hate it. I wrote a historical romance, and it did better. That one book did better than 18, up to that point, 18 Peter stories had done in 2 years. It made more money in 3 months. And I was like, all right.
But was that because of the audience?
Yes. It's okay. Certain subgenres are just not nearly as commercial. I mean, you're going to, in children's literature, in what I did, and not writing specifically to an audience and figuring out how I was going to market it beforehand. I mean, I've made pretty much every mistake you can make in my time writing. So speaking to your question, if you are like, I'm going to write the series and I absolutely want to sell books and I'm going to do my research, then yeah, then what you're saying, I would say actually look at your competition, which I did not do. I just wrote what I wanted to write, and I paid the price later. Yeah, look at your competition, see what, because really most children, if in fact, one of the pieces of advice I was told, they were like, hey, look, if you're aiming for a 10 to 12 crowd, you really need to make your protagonists older. They need to be 16, 17. It's like kids always want to read up. They want to find out about the older kids. They want to do what the older kids are doing. And I was like, oh, okay. But I'd already made up my mind and I was stubborn as a mule. So I continued down my path. With me writing the characters in Peter and the Monsters, part of it for me was I feel like an overgrown kid most of the time. I feel like I never truly grew up. And so it was kind of easier for me to tap into that voice. Now, some kids don't. I actually, my best friend, her son was about 11 and he started reading the series and he didn't like it. And he kind of put it aside. But then when he hit about 13, he liked hearing about the stories because he liked all the creepy stuff that I would tell him that was coming. And so he went back to it when he was about 14. And from what I understand, he kind of inhaled it. He just read as much as he could. So it does, I wrote entirely the wrong way. I wrote with, well, I mean, if you're looking for money, I wrote the wrong way. I took young protagonists that everybody's like, that's a kid's story. And then I pitched the sensibility more towards towards adults. The way I told people at the time too was, this is the story I would have liked to have read when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. Creepy stuff going on, mysteries, funny, harrowing action sequences, things like that. But to be honest, I just went instinctually. I'm sort of a right from the gut kind of writer, and I've paid for it a number of times, and Release is not doing very well financially. But I mean, does that answer your question?
It does, and it actually leads into Angelin's question. Angelin, you want to jump on?
I think you actually answered it. I was just wondering if you had an idea when you first started writing the series where you wanted it to go, the long view of where it was going, or did you kind of have a general idea about where you wanted it and it evolved along the way? But I think you kind of answered it after I wrote the question.
That's cool. I can tell you a little bit. It was a little bit of both. The first thing was I was like, I know I want to do this series with kids dealing with monsters, but I want there to be some sort of something there that ties it all together. One of the things that I thought about was in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the television show, when what I'd read was that the executives who were over the show said, why are there all these vampires here and not everywhere else? Why do all these bad things keep happening here? And so they decided, okay, we'll put a hellmouth there. We'll put a portal to hell, basically. And that's why all the bad stuff happens. So I was like, I need a reason why all this bad stuff keeps happening to this kid. Why this kid and why this town? And that was in the back of my mind when I started the first couple of stories. But it wasn't until that story number 6 where it was like, here's my hellmouth. Okay, this is what we're going to do. This is going to be the reason. And I think initially when I wrote story number 5, the mannequins and the whole story about the massacre, I was like, this could be it. This could possibly be it. And then I was like, no, I don't want to go down that road. And I wanted it to be more of to go back even further. And I knew that I wanted the devil, or whatever would be the devil figure, this Sumerian fire god. I didn't know it was a Sumerian fire god for like 18, 20 stories. But I knew it was some big, horrible, overwhelmingly powerful thing in the background that he was going to have to face. And so, yeah, it was knowing in the first 4 stories, this has got to go somewhere. 6th story, I think I've got the broad strokes now. And then with each story, as I put in new clues, kind of refining it and refining it. By the time I got to story number 18, I knew pretty much everything. But that was like that was probably more like, by the time I got to 18, that was about 5 years from the time the very first time I started it. I started off the series blogging it. I started writing it, and I was like, I'll gain an audience online. And so I started blogging at a page a day, and this was before Wattpad existed. So I had this blogspot thing, and I was trying to advertise, and that didn't work out. What's funny is that I still have people write in and are like, I've been there since the beginning. I was there on Blogspot when you were doing it a page a day. But so it was about 5 years before I finally had everything nailed down. So there was a long time of, what if this, I mean, I knew the direction I wanted to take, but I didn't know the specifics. So yeah, does that answer your question? Okay, cool.
Okay, well, that actually leads into Jim's question. Jim? Jim? Oh, are you trying to me to unmute you? I'm trying. Ask to unmute. There you go.
I forgot the question.
Okay. Your question was about the.
Oh no, I know the question.
Okay.
But it's a question that you kind of asked, which is that it was a target audience. If this was an 8 and 10-year-old, then how do you get the 8 and 10-year-old interested in this level of content? And you explained that it turned out that your friend's son didn't get interested at that level and picked up much later, even though the characters were still 8 and 10.
Yeah, they age. It takes about, they basically go from 10 to 12 over the first 34 stories. And yeah. And then after that, there's like a 5-year jump to when they're in their junior year of high school. But those first like 12 to 18 stories is all take place within 1 year. So they're about 10 to 11.
So the youngster who didn't get interested until he was 14, then the primary characters was still much younger than he.
Yep.
Which is an interesting twist. Have you had anyone look at your stuff in terms of grade level, the writing?
This is a huge mistake that I made, is that I just wrote what I wanted to write, what I thought would be interesting. Later on in my career, when I was like, I need to make money, I declared bankruptcy in 2010, and I was living at home with my parents at 37 years old. And I was like, whatever age I was. Yeah, pretty much. And I was like, I got to get out of here. And I don't want to tell you the story about me trying to pitch an agent back in 2008. I'll get to that in a second. But what happened was I started publishing on Kindle, the first few books. And after I badgered everybody I knew to buy a copy, and then most of them didn't, there were no sales whatsoever. And I was like, oh, and this was before Kindle Unlimited came out, which was around 2014. So 2011. And there was a way to, and you can still do it now, but it's not nearly as effective, to make a book go perma-free by making it 0 on Barnes and Noble and on other retailers, and then Amazon would match the price to 0. And when that happened, free books were a much bigger commodity in 2011. So people started getting it, and I started getting readership, and then things were going up and up and up. And I got to about $1,800 a month. And I was like, yeah, this is how I'm getting out of my parents' house. And then it started going down, down, down. I was like, no, don't do that. And that was when I made the choice. I was like, I got to write something that sells. So I went out and I looked, and I found a historical romance at the top of the Kindle free 100 list. And I was like, let's check this out. And I read about 30, 40 pages, and I was like, this is terrible. I can do better than this. And I did. I wrote a book. I'd never written a romance before. I like to tell people that I'd only read Pride and Prejudice. I only considered that to be the single romance novel that I'd ever written. And it did better than all my children's stories, but I hate research, which is one of my fatal flaws. So I was like, I'm not writing any more historical romances. So I basically went out and read a knockoff of 50 Shades of Grey, which was just starting to peak at that point. And I read the knockoff and I was like, this is terrible. I could do better than this. And I did. And that series that I wrote was one of my best sellers. Now I've done that again later on in another genre, in the fantasy genre. I read a book and I was like, this is terrible. I can do better than this. And I bombed horribly because I didn't understand the audience, and they didn't want character development. They didn't want this and that. They didn't want all the things that I thought made a good story. They wanted wish fulfillment, and they wanted, a guy as the main character who kicks ass. And I didn't give them that. And whoo, I got roasted in the reviews for that. And I learned my lesson. But one of my flaws is I say, oh, I'm going to write to market. Oh, I'm going to do this. And then I really just go ahead and do what I want. And that's what I did with Peter, which was, from a commercial point of view, it was a disaster. I mean, no money in it. And here's the story that I had to tell you about when I first started this. It was about 2008. I'd written maybe 6 or 7 of the stories, and I decided I'm going to go get an agent. Kindle didn't exist at that point. And so I tried submitting. I'd submitted Imaginary Friends, and I'd submitted another book, the very first novel that I finished back in like 1994, and never got an agent. And it was grueling, and I hated the rejection. And so I found this agency. They were like, send us your book. If we like it, we'll take it on. If we don't like it, though, you know what? You can still pay us $400 and we'll send out query letters for you. And I was like, yes, I don't have to go through the horrible, like, please read my book and knowing I'm going to be rejected. So I sent them the first story. And I was like, I'm totally fine with paying the $400. I didn't hear from him. So I called him up and I got the secretary. And she says, I said, yeah, I sent in this book, Peter and the Vampires. She's like, oh yeah, I remember that. She said, yeah, we're not going to represent it. And I said, no problem. I just want to pay the $400 and you can send it out. The query letter's out. She was like, yeah, we're not going to do that either. And I was like, what are you talking about? And so she says, well, it's a children's book and children's books just don't sell. And I was like, this is like Harry Potter, which was huge, gigantic at the time. I was like, are you telling me Harry Potter doesn't sell? And she says, hold on a second. And I hear her get up from the phone and click, 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 click her heels. And then she's gone for about 20 seconds. And then she comes back. And she was incredibly nice during this entire thing, super polite, very sweet. She was like, yeah, I just talked to the agent. And she said, it's also, it's about vampires. It's not going to sell. Vampires are over. Twilight, I don't even know that the first movie might have come out. The Vampire Diaries had not even debuted on the CW network yet. It was going to do 11 seasons, and then Bella Thorne, I think, not Bella, that's the actress. Bella Forrest was years away from doing her vampire series on Amazon that sold a squillion copies and made so much money. But I was like, are you kidding me? And I think I brought up the CW Diaries. And so I kept sending her back and forth between the agent like 4 or 5 times. And then finally she said, look, here's the problem. People are just going to see vampires on the cover and they're going to see it's a children's book and they're going to throw it in the trash. She said, you can pay us if you really want, but we think it's a waste of time, of your time and your money. And I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, I was thankful to them for being honest with me, but I was grumpy and angry about it for the longest time. And I was like, I'm just going to keep doing it because I'm an ornery cuss. And when you tell me not to do something, I'm going to do it. They warned me. They were right. If you have a machine behind you, now, this is my experience. I could be wrong. And if you're good at marketing, and if you actually write to your intended audience and you hook up with other authors, and now too, there's ways to advertise. But at the time, I made all the wrong choices of what I was trying to do was sell the book and make money. I basically wrote it the way I wanted to write it with an adult sensibility, and the protagonist just happened to be very young. And that's why a lot of my fans are older, than 20s through 60s. And A lot of them are parents who bought the book for their kids, started reading it to them or with them, and then became fans, and they finished the entire series. But
Well,
the
let- let-
way I've, go
I was
ahead.
going to say, Darren, let me stop you there and ask you a question.
Sure.
Because I know that there has a tendency to have things piggyback off each other. You mentioned Harry Potter, and you mentioned all the different things in on the CW and so forth. It's like, I think Angela and I are locking key fans from Netflix, which reminds me of Peter and the Peter and
Mhm.
stories. But I'm wondering if at any time did you feel that your topics, like you said, Frankenstein and mannequins, at any time did you feel like your devices that you're using to tell a story alienated your young audience or intrigued them because there were already other content that was being created that mimicked what you were doing?
Okay, so that's a good question. And by the way, I want to say one thing too, is finally a series came out. Nobody knew I didn't know exactly how to tell them what my series was. And then Stranger Things on Netflix comes out, which is very close to what my series is in one way. Young protagonists, very adult, very scary kind of atmosphere and thematic stuff. So that's really what the Peter stories is. It's a lot funnier in a lot of ways. It's very much a comedy, but young protagonists, scary stuff. Did I alienate some younger? I don't think I ever even reached them. That was the main problem. Just, it's so difficult to, like I said, there are no 10-year-olds trolling Amazon. If I were to, and I'm going to do this someday, but if I were to give any advice to somebody who's writing this sort of series, you want to try to get to the parents. Those are the people. The problem is that your competitors, the Harry Potters, the Percy Jacksons, they have the machine behind them. They're the ones that have the visibility. Most kids at that age, if they're going to read something, they're going to read a large mainstream novel that all the rest of their other students are reading, that they've heard about through them, or even better, if there's movies out about it. Oh, the movies are, yes, they're their own thing, but they're also just a gigantic multi-billion-dollar advertising campaign for the books. So when you're fighting against that, there's, in romance and mystery, there are rabid audiences that are looking for exactly what you have to offer. Your rabid audience is nowhere to be found on Amazon if you're writing, for 10 to 12-year-olds, which is why you need to go after the parents. And what I would do now is I would do Facebook ads. I would target moms with children in school, and I would specifically target, I was told this by a teacher. My sister knew someone who was a teacher. She found out about my books. She loved them. She had her middle grade, so 7th grade through 9th grade students read them. They loved them. So I had people that I know that if you get the book in front of kids, a certain number of them will love it. But I couldn't get the book in front of them. And she told me that your target audience, really the people you want to reach, are moms whose little boys don't want to read. And part of that is just because I have 2 boys as the main protagonists throughout the series. But she said that girls will read, but there's this stigma that starts to come up. The boys want to be cool, and obviously they want to go to run around and play sports and do things. But so with the distractions you have of video games, of television, of Netflix, of everything that's out there, there's this added problem where little boys just don't think it's cool to read. They think it's nerdy. And so obviously there are always going to be some little boys, but the vast majority who develop a problem, it's around the 4th to 5th grade where they're like, I just don't want to read. She was like, you need to go after those kids, and you specifically need to get to them through their moms who are worried about their kids not reading. And I think that would be my perfect audience, because it's pretty gruesome. How far have you read, Lynn?
I think because I started writing and doing things, I think I got the story that's after the swamp monsters.
Okay, so you got to mannequins. All right,
Yeah.
It gets dark. Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, no,
it gets
no,
really
no.
dark.
It was there's a scene that he's written in the one with the folks that are out in the cornfield.
Mm,
Uh-huh.
the first one, Peter and the Dead Man. Yeah.
Yeah, Peter and that folks is his scene and the way he writes it is reminiscent of Children of the Corn. It freaks you out that much. And you know, whenever I was reading Harry Potter, there's a scene that J.K. Rowling writes that, you know, kind of shook me up, and it was set in the forest and the Dementors were coming.
Yeah. Good scene.
That one really shook me up. But whenever I read your one with the dead people in the corn, it sent me back to the memory of watching Children of the Corn when I was a young kid, going, man, that freaked me out. And you know, I had a really second guess myself, because I love and hate Salem's Lot. And so I was thinking about the vampire as well. So let me ask you another question.
Can I throw in one more thing real quick?
Sure.
I think part of this obsession where I was like, I want to write the book I want to write is you heard my mother was very super conservative and religious, and I wasn't allowed to read much. I would go into this bookstore and there were two books. One was an Alfred Hitchcock anthology, and the other was an H.P. Lovecraft book. And I didn't even know who those people were. I had no idea, but it was the cover art, especially on the H.P. Lovecraft one, with this tree with these eyes embedded in the hollows and these giant spiders, and just monstrous and disturbing. And I was like, I want to read that so much. And I wouldn't have enjoyed the language that, you know, H.P. Lovecraft is, you know, very adult and kind of this over the top writer. I wouldn't have enjoyed it, but it was this sort of fascination with the darkness, and I wanted so badly to read it. The reason I wanted to read the Alfred Hitchcock was because when you opened up the book, on the inset there were all these creepy images, like an eyeball and like a butcher's knife with blood and stuff like that. So I think that my books would absolutely repel people who don't want to be scared. That if you don't want to be little kids who don't want to be scared, it would make them run away, throw the book across the room. But it would put its hooks into little kids who want to be scared, who want that kind of feeling. And that's what I wanted as a kid, and that's what I wrote as an adult. So sorry to interrupt, please.
Well, no, I'm glad you mentioned the cover, because that was my next thing. Your covers, I know you have a brand that you've created for your covers.
My covers are terrible.
Well, no, not necessarily, but they're consistent. I mean, they are consistent compared to what they originally were. You have some consistency going on now as far as a brand that has been established for each one of those pieces. But my question is how do you juggle the brand that you've created, which is red cover, silhouette, and text, versus like what Jim has done, which is have artwork that depicts a scene or an activity that's in the book that would draw attention. And Jim, if you want to give insight, because you're the only other kid writer that we have here, and you've had experience with covers, I'm kind of curious as to what you balance and how you do it. And then after we discuss this, if anyone doesn't have any other questions, we can go ahead and let you go, because you've been talking for about 45 minutes.
Oh, good. I hit the time. I was like, this is only gonna last 20 minutes, and it's gonna be, everybody's gonna be okay. So hey, I hit the time limit. Yay! Thank you for your questions, by the way. I greatly appreciate that. But so Jim, did you want to chime in on the covers or anything like that? Because I have something to say on the covers. This would be.
Yeah, Lynn's pointing out my covers are drawn as kids. They're not pictures. They're not clear, but they're consistent. And I remember the first time I showed it to maybe our 8-year-old or 7-year-old granddaughter. You know, can you see what's on this? And she says, oh yeah, it's a ghost. But a lot of people couldn't see that it would be a ghost, but she was tuned into it. So
Cool.
That was more the approach that I was taking, was to shoot for what would tie into that age group.
Gotcha.
And
Sounds
so
good.
far, it's been less successful than yours.
Well, it's a tough genre. In fact, okay, so here's what I have to say. On day one of that course that I talk about, by the way, I think we'll throw up a thing later, but if you want to find out more about it, it's at 30-day novelcourse.com. I think that'll lead you to the thing. And by the way, anyone who wants to ask me questions, feel free, whether now or anyone watching this in the future, contact me at darrenpillsburybooks@gmail.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions you got. So what I tell people on the first day of the course is these things: if you want to make money, if you don't care about the money so much, no big deal. But if you want to make money, the single most important decision you will make is what subgenre you write in. And I differentiate that from genre, the overarching mystery, thrillers, romance, sci-fi. Your subgenres will depend on how successful you can be. And the children's, specifically what I'm writing, had I actually gone for urban paranormal, set them older, 17 to 18. If I'd put them in college age so I could do an urban paranormal, I think the financial, it could have done much better than it did. That was one of the, from a commercial standpoint, I wrote the series out of love. I've written plenty of things since then purely for the money. This is the one that I love, and that if all my books burned and were wiped off of servers through some EMP, this is the only thing that I would go back and rewrite again, because I love it that much. It means that much to me. It was basically therapy, and it was my subconscious pouring itself gradually out on the page. I look back now and I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was struggling with that at the time. But so you're choosing your subgenre is the single most important thing you can do if you want to make money. And then the second most important thing is get a great cover. And my covers stink for the children's series. I made the brutal mistake, and it's most beginning writers make it. They don't spend money on their cover, and I didn't. And when the sales just stayed down. Now there's a caveat to this, because just about a year ago, I invested about $700, $800 and got a great cover from demonza.com for the first book. And I was like, this is beautiful. And I redesigned it so it is more like the current Harry Potter ebook covers that are very graphical. And you know, the first one, for instance, as the lightning bolt with Hedwig and with the letter. What you want with a cover is you want people to look at it immediately and know what subgenre is. The people who read that sort of subgenre, you want them to be like, that's my jam, that's it. Let me take a look at this. You want it to be immediately apparent what it is. You want it to be visible, if you're an indie especially. You want it to be visible at about 1 inch high, because that's how the vast majority of people are going to see it on Amazon. So when they're scrolling through, it's got to be eye-catching enough to stand out from the rest. It needs to be clear. Your title and your author's name, hopefully, but definitely your title should be clear. The font should be clear enough for it to be read, and people should be able to say, "Oh, I should go to it," and they be like, "Oh, that's the kind of thing I like," and click on it. That's the second most important thing. It's really literally your subgenre and your cover, and you nail those, and you're a halfway competent writer in that subgenre, you'll do okay. If it's a popular subgenre. I made all the mistakes in the world. I chose the wrong subgenre for money for this children's series because I wanted to write what I wanted to write, and my covers were pretty bad. The fonts were illegible at that size. They weren't that good. At some point, I will go back, I'll revamp all of the covers. I'll have a professional do it. Now, once I got into romance, I learned my lesson, and I started paying, $500, $600 minimum for a cover. Once I got into fantasy, I had to pay for painted art as well as the font design. So some of my covers ran $1,300. They sold really, really well, because by that point, I'd picked a lucrative subgenre, and I had a cover that drew the eye and people knew exactly what it was. And when I deviated from that, and I did a couple of times, I made mistakes, the book usually bombed, didn't do well. If people knew exactly what it was by looking at it, if it looked good, it enticed them to click, read on the blurb. That's pretty much find a big enough hungry crowd that likes what you're selling. They like the look and the cut of your jib. They'll give you a shot, especially now with Kindle Unlimited, that anybody's paying $9.99 a month doesn't have to they don't have to roll the dice on you being a great author. There are downsides to it now that people have so much on their Kindles that, yeah, they might borrow you and they might never look at your book. Eventually it'll just collect dust, digital dust on their Kindle, but at least it's a much easier in. And if you're a good enough writer in your subgenre, and you don't have to be great, you don't have to, there are a lot of people in the fantasy subgenres that I've written, I considered pretty mediocre writers that are doing huge sales that make several hundred grand a year. That's my own personal snobbishness, that I don't like their writing style so much and there's not character development, but they know what their audience wants. They know what people want to read when they read that style of book, and they give it to them. And that's also been one of my biggest flaws, commercially speaking, is I write the kind of book I'd want to write, or I write the kind of book I'd want to read. And the kind of book I'd want to read is not necessarily what the people in that subgenre want to read. And Peter and the Monsters is a perfect example of that. It's just not being able to get to the audience that I need, which is, you know, children, because most people say kids books. I'm an adult, I'm not going to read that. And so, and then if they do and they give it a chance, they're usually sucked in because of the more adult sensibility, the darkness of the themes and what happens in the book. But so that's my commercial advice. Write in a popular subgenre if you care about money. If you don't care about money, you're like, it's secondary. I want to write something that I love. Don't worry about it. You can write whatever you want. But if you're looking for money, write in a popular subgenre, get a great cover that matches up, stands next to any of the bestsellers in that subgenre, where people can't tell you from a New York Times bestselling author, and write a great blurb and be the best writer you can be. But don't wait until you're some amazing, perfect, ideal writer. Get out there, do it. You'll learn along the way, and you might be very surprised by how successful you are.
That's excellent. Darren, can you tell us your pen names before you leave? Because I know there's probably a couple of people who want to read your erotica and check your romance out too.
I struggled with this because I'm a little afraid somebody, but then again, it's I mentioned my pen names in the sales letters. So it's like, oh, well, yeah, sure. And if anybody's made it this far in the Zoom video, then I figure it's not a 12-year-old. So yeah, I wrote, and be very careful. The stuff that I've written in romance and in fantasy is very explicit. So yeah, this is warning, fair warning. It's not PG-13. It's not even R-rated. It's out there. But are you still want me to reveal?
Well, I was gonna say that, you know, if you're writing young horror stuff, and I was 40-something years old at the time, and you scared me, then I'm now scared to go read your erotica.
yeah. You should. I'll tell you what, if you want to know the pen names, email me at darrenpillsburybooks@gmail.com. Say, I'm over 18 years old, and I will tell you what the pen names are. I have no problem telling anybody. I'm just a little leery of putting it out there in a forum because, yeah, I write for, 12-year-olds. I want there to be a firewall between my children's books and the other stuff. And I actually hesitated doing the course for a long time because I was like, oh no, kids can find out with this other stuff that I've written. But then I was like, yeah, all 300 kids that are out there that have read the book. So that's why I reveal it. But yeah, Darren Pills, do you have the slide by any chance with the, if you don't, it's not a problem.
No, I do. And I was
okay.
going to pop it up, but I'm having some difficulties because.
No worries. Yeah, if Darren Pillsbury Books at gmail.com, you can Google my name on Amazon, and at least as long as you come close to Darren Pillsbury, you'll probably find me. So it's just Darren Pillsbury Books at gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from you guys. And if you have any other questions or want to have skinny follow-up questions, I'm more than happy to tell you what I know.
Okay, need to jump in here. Our time's about up in our meeting room. Can we all thank our guest speaker for some wonderful content?
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I've really enjoyed this.
All right.
Thank you for
Thank you, Lynn, for your MC abilities. We appreciate that as well, because we're all technologically challenged around here.
Not a problem.
Same here. Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh no, just do you have a PowerPoint presentation? I was like, That's gonna be my PowerPoint presentation.
You're
So
right up
thank you.
our alley, yeah. Well, the
Thank you for handling all that, Lynn.
in this library, a big cord. to
Yeah.
fit-
So we can attach ourselves next time.
Cool. Very
Uh,
cool.
Thank you
Phil-
so much.
Phyllis,
Thank
is
you.
there
Thank you.
anything else that you need to do before we end? And because it's on Facebook Live and I'll end it here in a few seconds. Do you need to go over the anthology committee report or anything, or y'all just want to?
Let's just have some brief reports for members only, if you don't mind.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good. Thanks again, everybody. I'm going to sign off, and good luck to all of you. Please